Hi, this is George Mueller, and this is an introduction to Chapter 11 for students in my History 101 class. In this video, we're going to briefly talk about the Black Death and the Great Schism of the Catholic Church. When you think of the Middle Ages, one of the things that always comes to mind is the plague. And it's a topic that is pertinent all throughout history, including today. One of the great fears of mankind is that a huge plague will break out again. And in recent years, we have had a number of diseases that have challenged our ability to deal with them, ranging from AIDS, which is incurable, to Ebola, which is difficult to control, to the H1N1 bird flu, which there really isn't a good treatment for. But to understand why the Black Death was so destructive, you have to look at what was going on around it. From about 1250 to 1850, and those are really soft borders on each side, there's what's known as the Little Ice Age. And this is a time period when, for reasons that we can't completely explain, the world gets cooler, significantly cooler. And there are wet, cold years, several years where there's no summer at all in much of Europe, and you have things like snow in July in Cairo, Egypt. So it's cold. And it's all the more debilitating because it comes after the medieval warm period, which runs from the 10th through the 14th centuries. And yes, they do overlap. In both of these, you're talking about average temperatures changing. And during the medieval warm period, the ice packs and glaciers had retreated significantly, further than they are today. During the Little Ice Age, they advanced rapidly. And people during this time really had no way to explain why these were advancing the way that they were. Now, the side effect of the Little Ice Age is that crops fail repeatedly starting around 1300. So when 1348 rolls around, you have a public that is hungry. Their malnourishment is general. Your average person is actually significantly malnourished. And this isn't the first time that the plague had ever appeared in Europe, but it hadn't been seen for 600 years. It most likely was held in what's known as a biological reservoir in Mongolia and spread into China, from China down to India, and then from India, traders brought it from the Black Sea over to Italy. Now, this plague spread throughout Asia. Both China and India were hard hit by the plague. It also hit North Africa. Egypt had significant problems, as did the whole Muslim world with the plague, and all the way down to Africa, clear down to the Cape of Good Hope on the very tip of southern Africa. So this became a huge thing that will impact world history. It doesn't cross over to the Americas or to Australia, but they're really the only places that escape. And the plague spread fast. It took about 3 years to be virtually throughout Europe. Now, there were some ways you could avoid the plague coming to your town. One would be if you simply close it off and don't let anyone come in. And some places, you can see them in green on this map, did so. By the way, these, pardon me, these kind of taupe areas, it's not that the plague didn't go there, it's that there aren't records for them. So Egypt definitely suffered from the plague. It's just not on this map. These places in green actually cut themselves off. And some villages cut themselves off for a long time. In some cases, into the 19th century. And there's some good reasons to fear the plague. This is a modern person in India I think this was from the outbreak in the 90s. Um, and that's the bulbo, the swelling that appears. And this is the thing that spreads it, fleas. When a flea bites you, it injects a little bit of blood from its stomach along with an anticoagulant into your blood and then sucks your blood out. So it transmits bacteria that way. And the plague had a huge mortality rate. We theorize that somewhere between, there are a whole bunch of numbers, 25 to 35. I've seen numbers up to 50% of the population of Europe died in 3 years. It's hard to say. Records are just totally incomplete, and people into the 19th century, actually people into the early 20th century, were finding villages that had been abandoned during the plague. There's a fairly famous story of a German village that wasn't rediscovered until well after the founding of the US, right around the 1840s, that had simply been abandoned when everyone there apparently died from the plague. And again, I have to mention, this hit the rest of the world too. And it's not like the plague appeared once and then disappeared. It kept coming back for the next 300 years. About every generation, every 25 years or so, the plague would spread through Europe and the rest of the world again. Now, there were a number of theories about why the plague appeared. One theory was that it was a miasma, a gas from the ground that came up. This probably sounds really primitive and silly, but when volcanoes erupt, they do sometimes release toxic gases. That happened in South America in several places this year. So it's not a completely insane idea. And there was a series of earthquakes about the same time the plague appeared. So it wasn't actually a ridiculous claim. A more common theory was that it was the anger of God. And there's a specific biblical passage that they read as suggesting that someone who was sinful would be more likely to be diseased. Now, modern theologians don't read this passage that way, but they did at the time. And it should be noted, Muslim and Chinese and Indian scholars all arrived at a similar idea. So this seems to be less a problem, pardon me, less a problem with Christian theology than it's a typical thing people do. Another typical thing people did was blame women. In Egypt, for example, women were ordered entirely off the streets for a number of months, shut up in their houses. In Europe, prostitutes, male or female, were driven out of cities, and brothels were closed, which actually wasn't a terrible idea. Not the driving people out of the city, but closing the brothels actually probably impacted the death rate. Another theory that was passed around was that Jews were poisoning water wells. The video that you'll watch will go into a lot more detail about this, but there were a number of cities where the Jewish population was virtually exterminated. And again, it should be noted, this wasn't just something that happened in Europe. Religious minorities were blamed in a number of places. The Muslim world blamed pagans, and some even blamed ancient sites, things like the pyramids, and destroyed them, trying to avert the anger of God, or in some cases stop up places where they thought the poisonous gases were seeping out of. The Chinese blamed the Mongols and others. Everybody found someone to blame. Most treatments in the medieval world were based on the medicine of a Greek doctor named Galen. Galen believed that health was the result of a balance of elements within the body. And since you were having a swelling because of the plague, he believed you had too much blood. So you would treat that by bleeding. The problem with that is you're cutting someone, probably with a dirty knife, so that's another route for infection to get in, and removing blood, which weakens them. So that's not a good idea. A few doctors hit on the idea of actually cutting the bulbo, which allowed pus to escape, which is disgusting and does run the risk of causing infection, but reducing the swelling in that way can save the patient. so it mostly failed. Another group were the flagellants, and the video you're going to watch for another assignment will go into a little more detail about them. One thing I did want to mention is the flagellants were not approved by the Catholic Church, who saw them as religious competition. And there was actually some medicine developed. Plague doctors wore this distinctive costume with a mask shaped like the beak of a vulture, stuffed with aromatic herbs, and glasses, and wearing gloves, and looking a little bit like a modern hazmat suit. This actually worked a little bit. One of the ways the plague could be spread was by someone coughing, and I promise, by the way, when I cough, it's not because I have the plague. It's just allergies. But when you coughed, a fine spray of spittle goes out and carries the disease. This would offer some protection. And other treatments, things like quarantining cities that were suffering from the plague, embargoing materials coming from those areas, keeping the rats out, and figuring out that cleaning patients who were sick. Yes, somebody had to realize you need to clean them. And putting them, pardon me, plague, and putting them in an area with good ventilation all does help, as does feeding them well. And yes, people before this often didn't feed people who were sick. Now, the plague has a lot of impacts, but the one I like to mention is art. After the plague, Western art gets an element of the macabre that it just didn't have before. And you can see that up to the modern day. As late as 2012, Iron Maiden had an album named after the plague that had songs which charted, which were about World War I battles and the plague. It actually made it to #2 in the UK. Metallica is a popular band. They use this kind of imagery. And it's not just older bands from the 80s and 70s. You have Grammy Award winners Ghost BC. They're still using the Plague Doctor uniform. And the reality is, this wasn't the end of the world. The Black Plague did a lot less damage than a mortality rate might suggest. Most of the people who died were the very old and the very young. Florence, for example, lost 50% of its population, but within 2 years, they had 100% of their tax revenues. And workers, if you survived the plague, really gained. There were so many fewer people working, rent went down, pay went up, and real wages rose by, according to some scholars, as much as 90%. Essentially had double the money. And here's the spot where we need to talk about what's happening with the Catholic Church. Under Pope Clement V, who was a Frenchman, the Catholic Church moved its headquarters from Rome to Avignon in what's modern-day France, although at that time it was Italy. And there he set up a new court for the Catholic Church, modeled after the courts of kings and queens. And it was known for its sumptuous meals and brilliant courtly life, and it attracted politicians from around Europe. But it also became known for decadence and corruption, and poets like Francesco Petrarch harshly criticized the expense of the Avignon papacy. Gregory XI returned the Catholic Church to Rome in 1377, but he immediately died. On his death, Italians demanded the election of an Italian pope, and they went so far as to actually threaten the cardinals. Now, when the rest of the cardinals escaped, they claimed that this was not a legal election, which is legitimate, and then elected a Frenchman. And now the Catholic Church had 2 popes. This is what's known as the Great Schism. From there, pardon me, you'll be able to read in the textbook all about the schism. I'm also going to put up this PowerPoint on Blackboard. And as usual, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. But don't hit that like button. Don't go to my Patreon page that doesn't exist, because I'm not a YouTuber. and I'll see you in the next intro.